Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in today's video, we're going to do a What's New for Fusion for January of 2026. So this is an update that we kind of knew was coming, and intent-driven design is now the default workflow. I don't even see a way that you can not use intent-driven design. And so when this was updated back in, I guess probably November, I mentioned to everybody that you should play around with it because it's coming and this is what it's going to be from now on. If you like the old workflow of Fusion where you could have bodies and components, you could convert them, do whatever you wanted, then you can go ahead and stick with a hybrid design. This will behave most like it used to in Fusion with some nuanced differences. So you see we've got an assemble menu, and basically everything is back in this sort of in the hybrid workflow how it used to be. And the difference is if we go to a part design or an assembly design, we don't have access to those assembly tools, and the assembly design by default is going to be internal only. There are ways that we can get around that by converting it to a different type of design. For example, a hybrid design we can convert on the fly. If you happen to make an assembly, which again is by default external only, you can again change it to a hybrid design if you wish. There will be limitations to this. So if you have a hybrid design with internal components and you try to convert back to an assembly, I think it'll probably get mad at you. But you can go to the utilities and enable modeling tools, which will bring back solid surface tools and things like that. So we've already talked about intent-driven design when it first came out. I'm not going to really dive into it here, but this is going to be your default workflow. So if you haven't tried it out and played around with it, it's probably going to be a little bit of a disruption. Just know that you can convert between parts and assemblies and the hybrid approach, and you can kind of go back and forth with some limitations. But if you are looking at getting used to the way it works now, it's going to be more of a traditional CAD program where you have parts and assemblies, and then the hybrid is kind of like that option to use it how Fusion exists. I really thought that I would prefer the hybrid approach, and I have found myself with pretty much everything I do starting in just the part design. And when I was primarily a SolidWorks user, I would do pretty much everything as a part. Even assemblies, I would do them as sort of these multi-body parts and then break them out from there. And so again, if you want to figure out what works for you, or if you have any questions, leave a comment. I'll do my best to answer those. But the new sort of default workflow is this intent-driven design, which you pick your part or assembly, which is external only, or the hybrid approach. The next thing that we got, and again, with all these videos, and I say them in every one, if this is the first time you've seen one of our update videos, then keep in mind we are not going to cover everything. What I like to do is hit the highlights that I think applies to the most people. There are tons of updates to the collaborative environment, the collaborative editing hubs. Not everybody has that by default, so things, those don't really translate to everybody, and it really works best if you're in a big team. So we'll kind of mention and cover some of those things, but we're going to focus on what I consider more of the big, impactful updates. So the next update that I want to talk about is the addition of a new constraint type. And so this new constraint type is tangent. And so if you use constrained components, then when it first came out, you had the align and the angle option. On the last update, we got the center option, and now in this update, we get a tangent option. And this works pretty well. And what I mean pretty well is it's not a perfect solution, but in this case, you'll see that we can make these two objects tangent. When I say it's not a perfect solution, there are situations where it's going to, so for example, you can see this body is overlapping because a perfect cylinder like this is going to have a straight edge at its contact point, and it's contacting something that has some curve to it. So there is going to be situations where these two things don't really sit tangent very well, so you can see there is some overlap. Now I imagine it's looking at some sort of point contact and figuring this out. So like I said, it's a good solution. It's not a perfect solution because it's not really looking at the same type of thing that we would see with contact sets, for example, but that is a new option that we have now. All right, so the next thing on our list is something that Fusion has been doing for a while, and they've called it something like unified experience. And so essentially what happens with certain features, and it happens in patterns, it's happened in other things. What happens is they start to they add options inside of the dialog where you can flip back and forth between different types of that thing. And so for this release, what we have is this for construction geometry. So in other CAD packages, a lot of times you'll go in and you'll click create construction plane, and then based on your selections, you will get the available options for the type of construction plane to get. That is not how this works. This is essentially just a picker that lets you select the type and then go through a drop-down list for the things you want. There's no inherent logic in your selection, for example. So, if I select these two faces, it's not going to give me a midpoint plane. It's still looking at whatever you have in your dropdown. And so, again, this is something that Fusion has done for a while. We've seen it with things like patterns where they added multiple patterns. It doesn't mean that all the other buttons have gone away. It just means that it's easier to access through a single click point. You don't have to go through this drop-down list anymore. You could click offset plane, and then you could come in here and select the type you want, or you could go to axis and do that. You also notice I have this UCS button here, this user coordinate system. This is a preview feature that you can turn on, allowing you to create a UCS or a coordinate system, but that is not a default option. So if you don't have that, you'll likely just see offset plane. Since we're here, let's go ahead and also talk about patterns. So with patterns, there is an update here, and I'll go ahead and I'll talk about it a little bit. And so with the patterns historically, let's go ahead and let's do a mirror. This will probably show it a little bit better. So with patterns historically, when we're patterning a feature, for example, the calculation option for a feature pattern, let's just pick a plane, it doesn't matter, historically was adjust or optimized. And now what they've done is they've switched the default behavior to identical. And so again, it's a minor change, but this is going to be the default option that is on for any of these sort of patterns for features or for mirror, things like that. The other change that's happened with this is actually the ability for the Fusion session when it's open to remember your selection. And so if, let's say, for example, you want to use the optimized option, when you click OK and you go back to do another mirror, for example, and let's just mirror this and select a plane, it remembers that we used optimized. And so that's a nice option. More so for me than setting the default to identical, having it remember what my choices are is important. This comes across on a lot of different features, and I wish that it was pervasive throughout all the things that we do in a Fusion session. If you are constantly doing things like adding a joint or copying or doing things like that, it helps if it remembers the last setting, because a lot of times it is the same thing. So those are some changes that have happened. Again, kind of unifying the location of some of these options with the patterns, and it applies to all the patterns. If you're doing something like a feature pattern, it'll give you the identical by default, but it will remember what you're doing as well. All right, the next thing that we have is the patch tool. And so the first thing I'll note is if you are working with surfaces and you don't see this sort of brownish yellow color, this is an option in your user preferences to show the normal direction of the surface. So what you have to do is go into, I believe it's graphics, and then enable surface normal display. And so if you have that on, you'll see the sort of yellow color on the backside of a surface. And then whatever the appearance is, in this case, the default steel, that'll be the normal side of that surface. And so what's happened is the patch tool now has a flip normal option. And so this is nice if you are worried about the normal direction of the surface. Now, you might think to yourself, why does it matter? Why do we need to worry about the normal direction? Well, in a lot of cases, when you have the normal direction of a surface or a plane, it dictates how other features behave. And so, for example, if we're creating offset surfaces or features that go away from a surface, the normal direction is the default behavior for those to be extruded. And so with our default planes, things like our XY plane, the normal direction of these planes is positive Z. And so when you create, let's say, a sketch on, let's just pick this plane, and we just do a sketch over here and we go to extrude it. When we extrude this, the positive value is in the normal direction and the negative value is opposite that. And so when we start to build these features, if we're going out from a surface, that normal direction can have an impact on these values, especially if you're doing things like linking them to parameters. Instead of having to do negative in the parameter value, you can simply just have a positive number there. And so it does matter in many cases. Once you stitch everything together into a solid, it's less important, but that is something to keep in mind. The next thing that came up that I think is a nice to have, but it's a very specific niche case, is the ability to control a layer of a decal. And like I said, this is a very specific thing because if you haven't run into it, you probably never will. And so the use case for this is if you have decals, typically or historically, you didn't have any ability to control where which decal was on top and which was on bottom. The way that it works now is how that is up in the decal folder is on the top layer. And so right now you can see, I'll go ahead and stop that. You can see visually that there is two decals here, and this one here, which is behind, is actually above it on the layer. Now, the downside to this is this doesn't change the way that we see the display on the screen. I wish that were the case. And so you really don't know until you go to render, because this larger logo or decal was added after the fact. It still sits on top visually just in the UI, but when you go to render it, whichever one is on top is going to be the one that renders on top of that layer. So I think it's a good step in the right direction, but I still think that if we could get those to flip visually based on the orientation or the location in this folder, that would really help out, because that's kind of going to be the indicator. If you've got a bunch of overlapping decals, that's going to be something that you aren't going to see until you go to start rendering. And if it's a big complex part or a complex scene, and you're possibly rendering locally, then that you just could waste some time before you figure out the potential issue. Okay, the next thing is something that I think a lot of other CAD packages have had for a while, and I think it's a great addition, but I do think that there is a little bit more work that could be done. And so what I'm talking about here is the addition of a midpoint line. And so the midpoint line gives us the ability to select a point and then create this line that goes out from that middle point. Now, the reason I say that there's more work to do is because right now you can't switch back and forth between a midpoint line and a traditional end-to-end point line. And so if you start to sketch and then you keep sketching, then what's going to end up happening is you're going to build out all these lines from that midpoint, and then you're going to have to go back and do things like trim them. And so if you go to a typical line tool, there's nothing in the sketch palette that lets you toggle back and forth between the typical line and a midpoint line. And so what I think would be a nice addition to this is if Fusion added the ability to either with a shortcut key, so let's say that you were drawing a line here and let's say you hold down Control or Shift or something. Now I know Shift is the one that disables the persistent constraints, but again, if there was like a shortcut key that could switch to a midpoint line, I think that would be really beneficial. So I think it's a good addition. I think, again, just like with the decal stuff, there's maybe a little bit more room for improvement there. All right, let's talk about, let's see, what's the next thing that we want to talk about? Probably mesh rebuild. We do a good bit of mesh on the channel, so let's just mention this tool. And again, I'm not going to cover every tool, but I do think that this one has some benefits. So this was a fairly okay scan of this bar clamp, and we've scanned this bar clamp and modeled it with different programs, different scanners on this channel a lot. But what I want to talk about specifically is the repair tool. And the repair tool is not something we usually use because we do a lot of processing in something like Quick Surface or just some basic processing here. But if we use the repair tool, we'll select the body. It tells us there's a hole, which has been around. But the addition here is in the rebuild section, we now have an adaptive option. And so if we just take a quick look at these and do a preview, Blocky is like a voxel-based rebuild. And then if we go to accurate or fast, this is going to give us some different results. But one thing that you're going to see here with the accurate or the fast is that we have a consistent mesh density. And so the problem with this is that there are areas of higher detail, like sharp corners, where we need a denser mesh, and then larger areas which are mostly flat, which we need a coarser mesh. And so the ability to do that now with the adaptive option allows us to get a new version of this that has larger mesh elements in areas that don't really need the density. And then we can get denser sections around features like filleted corners or sharp corners and things like that. And so this is a pretty nice option. And also note, even though we don't have the option for stitch and remove or close holes or wrap, it does actually go through and fill in the opening or the hole that we had. And so this is a nice addition, the adaptive option, which can be a really helpful thing if you're trying to do processing of scans once you bring them into Fusion. And so I think that's a good addition there. Again, it's one of those things where if you don't use it constantly, you probably didn't know that it was missing. But now that it's there, it's going to be a beneficial tool if you are doing some remeshing directly in Fusion. Okay, there are a couple of maybe honorable mentions, but let's talk about sheet metal for a second. So I'm going to create a new sheet metal design, and I will just make a simple part. Let's just go ahead and do this, and we'll turn that into a face. Just use the default settings. So the addition to sheet metal in 2026 here is the final addition of a hem tool. Now, this is something that should have been in Fusion for a long time, honestly, but it just was missing. And so now we have the hem tool, and you'll notice again that sort of unifying experience. You can go between flange and loft, which changed in maybe not the last update to Fusion, but an update before that. But now we've got the hem option, which gives us the ability to pick several things: our hem type, and where it needs to go, and so on. So right now we've got flat, there's an open hem type, the rolled hem type if you're using it for a hinge, for example, teardrop, rope, and double over. Now, of course, with these hems, you still need a way to manufacture this. If you're trying to do this on like a finger break at home, that's not going to happen. But if you are getting your parts manufactured, then the addition of a hem is something that is important to many different sheet metal designs. And now we finally have it directly here inside of Fusion. And once again, just like with the unifying of things like construction planes, that is all based inside of this flange tool. So you can click on the flange tool and then click hem. That's the same for loft. That's the same for any of the other types of flange. And also keep in mind, the flange tool is sort of a triple tool. You can use it for adding a flange here. So if you haven't done any sheet metal, you can use it for that. You can use it with a closed profile like we did first to create the base of our shape. And you can also use it as sort of an extruded profile as well. And so again, just an addition and expansion of those tools. I think one of the last kind of real things that's missing in here is the ability to use things like punch tools. Maybe that'll come in the future. I don't know. There is another addition, and I actually do want to just quickly mention it. I don't have a great example here, but we do now have the extent type option to object. So that can be pretty beneficial if you are trying to create in this case, an edge flange that goes up to something else. That can give you a complex end face without having to go through the process of splitting the body or doing an extrude cut or something later. So again, it's another nice addition to sheet metal that we have now with this new update. Okay. Probably the last maybe big option that we might see here is the addition of, well, I don't really know how to put this, but if you use automated modeling, there is now an option to use automated modeling with edit in place. And so if you don't use edit in place, or if you don't use assemblies with external designs, you probably never come across this. But for our purposes, I'm going to go ahead and I'll just toss this into my assembly. I'll place it where it is. And then with this is an external assembly, which means that if I want to make any changes to it, I have to use edit in place or open up the original design. There are ways that we can make associative references, but the big thing here that I'm mentioning is that automated modeling now works with edit in place. I don't really see a huge value to this, if I'm honest. Automated modeling is something that we've covered before when it first came out. It could be pretty good for things like shape discovery, or if you're trying to create keep out regions for a generative design setup. That could be a good application for the tool. The need for it to be inside of edit in place, I don't really see a ton of value there, but again, I just thought I would mention it that it is there. All right, so most of the other updates that we've had really involve drawings has gotten some updates. Some of them are kind of holdover from the collaborative editing team. And so I'm just going to make a quick mention to some of these tools because, again, it's going to be based on the hub that you're using in your data panel. And so most of the hubs have not been switched over to the new CE style hub. And one way that you can tell instantly is if you go to save your design, and actually let's do one that, let's just grab this one. If you go to save a design, if you get this little dialog box that pops up asking you for a version description and whether or not you want to create a milestone, that is an indicator that you still have the older style hub. The newer style hub, when you save, you don't get a pop-up dialog. Instead, to understand the history of your design, you have to go into history. And inside of the history dialog, which did get an update for this release, this will allow you to do things like create a version. And so there's a different distinction between milestones and versions. And again, this all gets, the water is pretty muddy on this one because, again, not everybody has switched over to it. And so I don't really want to go through it in this video because it's complicated to identify and understand. But just note that there are a lot of updates and a lot of focus is being placed on things like metadata for custom properties and things like management of that metadata, properties for your assemblies, custom properties that can be used in things like detailed drawing, notes, and tables. There are updates to bill of materials. All of these different aspects of that CE style hub, they don't really come into play until you have access to it or until your hub has been upgraded. As of right now, I don't know if there's any way to manually push an update. It just kind of happens. I do have another hub, a CE hub that I use, but again, my default hub that I've had since 2015 or so, that has not been updated yet. And so just keep in mind that there are some nuanced differences to the things that you'll see. One of those big indicators is what you see when you go to save your file. If you have that dialog pop up, you've got the older style hub. If you don't see that save dialog pop up for versions and milestones, things like that, you've got the new CE style hub. You also notice a difference in the properties of your bodies and components. In the older style hub, we have a much more limited sort of grouping of properties. Once you have the new CE style hub, the property dialog box here, what you see for bill of materials, what you see on the home tab, all of that stuff has been updated and is getting improvements. So once all of the hubs start to switch over to that, I'll talk about it a bit more. It really is a bigger benefit to those collaborating with a team. So if you're not a single designer, if you're working with a bunch of people, that's really where you'll start to see some of those things. The last thing that I really want to mention as sort of a performance update that can help a lot of people is under the view dropdown, we've got this performance overlay. Now, if you've seen any of our videos in plasticity, you'll know that plasticity has this kind of thing in the bottom right-hand corner, gives you information about things like the frame rate and the amount of memory that you're using and so on. And so if you're having performance issues or if you notice a lag, so right now we've got a large mesh here, and if I make the mesh selectable, one thing that we're going to notice is the performance typically gets worse because every time we hover the cursor over that, it needs to select all of the polygons. And so you can kind of play around with this and see or kind of play around with it, turning it on and getting an idea of how your system is performing. Things like the frame rate, if you've got a fairly low frame rate when you're trying to rotate and move, or if you're dealing with large assemblies or a single file that has a large number of internal components, you can get an idea of how that's affecting your performance. And so that's just under that file view drop down, and that's called performance overlay. Okay, so I think that covers most of the things that I wanted to mention. Again, the updates to the collaborative editing team, that kind of stuff we'll talk about more once all of the hubs get switched over or the teams. I think they're called teams now, but if you go to your data panel and you hover over here, it still says Fusion Hub. So I don't know what to call it, but we'll call it a team. But there have been again some updates to things like drawings. If you use automated drawings, there have been improvements there. You can start to see configurations inside of tables, so that stuff starts to show up in drawings. And again, there are some improvements to things like the save as workflow. So if you have a design, and I don't really have one here that's open, but if you have a design where you're including drawings, there'll now be a dialog box. So this file doesn't have any drawings, but there'll now be a dialog box that'll talk about if you're doing a save as or a save as copy. It'll tell you all of the extra files that are also going to get copied and created based on that. And so that's a nice thing to have if you're using a design that has drawings and has external components and you want to understand where all that stuff is and how it's coming together. You can see some of that data if you're inside of your data panel. There is a history, uses, used in, and drawings. This also changes a bit when you are on the CE style team. So just keep in mind that what you see here, the view is going to be a little bit different. But you can see like drawings that are used for those designs and so on. And you can identify uses and used in, kind of say where that design is also referenced or any external designs that are referenced in your current design. As I said, this stuff gets pretty complicated and murky, especially since not everybody is on the same sort of setup. And so talking about it seems like not a waste of time, but it's not going to apply to everybody. So I don't think it's worth the effort in this video, at least. If there are any updates that you've seen in the What's New, I will put a link to it in the description. But if there are updates that you saw that we didn't cover here, there were some updates to PCB, there are updates to CAM. Most of it's in the manufacturing extension for things like deburr and some multi-axis stuff. But if you did see an update that we didn't cover and you want me to dive deeper into it, just leave a comment and let me know. If you have any questions on what you saw here or want to dive deeper into any of these other updates, then let me know as well. And as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.